It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this panel, Good Morning in America, on the American election scene from a global point of view. My name is Adam Tooze. I'm the chair of the Committee of Global Thought at Columbia University, and this is the first of what we hope will be many conversations of this type that will extend out across the world from our base in New York and bring in audiences from wherever people are interested in logging in. We launched this conversation because, as we realize, the entire world is watching with bated breath what will happen in the American elections next week. And we thought it was essential and fascinating to bring into the room a variety of conversational partners from literally around the world to discuss this. And it's a real privilege to be able to welcome the panel that we have here and to engage with an audience which also reaches around the world. We'll be doing largely a panel-based conversation. We aim to wrap at the 10 a.m. mark in New York. That's an hour from now. Ambassador Rao has to leave somewhat earlier, but we'll stick to time. If it is possible at the end to take questions from the audience, we'll do that via the chat function. But we have such a rich offering of contributions from the panel that we're going to concentrate on that. It truly is an honor for me to introduce our panelists, starting with Madam Nirumpama Rao, who is the former Foreign Secretary of India and ambassador both to China and the United States in her distinguished career. It's truly a privilege to have you here with us, Madam. From Shanghai, Professor Wu Xinbo, who is the head of the Institute of International Studies and the Center for American Studies at Fudan University. From East Africa, from Kenya, we have Nerima Wako-Ojiwa, who is founder and director of Siasa Place, a youth-led political organization in Kenya. Her organization is dedicated to providing a platform for politics, and we were learning in the pre-conversation that Hindi and Arabic and indeed the entire Indian Ocean language sphere share a common word for politics, which is itself an extraordinary thing to learn. Next on the panel, we have Professor Evren Balta, Professor of Political Science at Özyeğin University from Istanbul, Turkey, currently a scholar in residence at the Weatherhead Institute for International Affairs in Harvard. Welcome, Evren. And last, Daniel Matamala, author and senior anchor of Chilevisión, joining us from the other half of the Western Hemisphere. We truly are privileged to have you all with us this morning. And what we thought we would do is start out, before we start exploring the network of connections which link you all, by asking every one of the panelists to give us your take on, first of all, how the American election, looking in at America, if you like, is being seen in your region. And then secondly, what you think the implications might be and what the stakes are for your region, how this is viewed from the outside, and then what the stakes are. I'll ask Ambassador Rao to kick us off with a few remarks from the Indian vantage point.
Thank you very much, and it's an honor to be participating in this panel today, Adam. Well, the U.S. elections affect, I believe, every part of the world, and we are no exception. India and the United States have a very consequential relationship, a very multifaceted relationship, a relationship marked by great constancy. And this is something that we hope will be continued and will be sustained and further strengthened after the US elections, regardless of which candidate wins. And why I say this is because the India-US relationship has grown from strength to strength in the last 2 decades, regardless of which party's candidate is in power. And that imparts a sense of confidence and a certain definition to that relationship today. But we live in a very disorderly world, and this disorder just doesn't mark the situation as far as the global stage is concerned. We see that kind of fractiousness and polarization within American society today, and that is a cause of some concern to all of us well-wishers of America around the world. We would like the rules-based international order to be sustained, and today it is under threat. And it seems that the West as a group of nations is changing. As James Baldwin said long ago, it seems to be breaking up, and you have the wars in Ukraine, in the Middle East, And the situation, I've said this before, underscores the weakness of the West. Here in the Indo-Pacific, marked by this junction of the two oceans, the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, we in India see ourselves as occupying a key geographical position. And that in many ways also defines our relationship with the United States today in terms of defense, in terms of security, in terms of trade and economics and investment and technology above all, because technology is what we need as a country for our accelerated development, which is something that India looks at in a very concerted way, because as you know, we are, I would say, the fastest growing economy in the world today, well positioned to take our slot, as it were, among the top growing economies of the world. So this is an India that looks at the global stage with confidence. We feel we are founded on a civilizational base today. I mean, it's been like that for millennia, and this is how we define ourselves as a civilizational state, not from a sense of, blowing our own trumpet, as it were, but that our civilization and our definition of diversity and constitutional democracy is founded very much in our roots, in our history, in our past, as a nation, a very plural, diverse nation. And therefore, when we talk of strategic autonomy, which we would like the United States to understand better where we are coming from, it is founded on our national interest. It's not founded on sentiment. And we will take decisions when we are faced with crises based on those interests. And we will not be really swayed by bloc politics or competing ideologies. So perhaps I should stop here and allow the discussion to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Many points to pick up on there for later. Professor Wu, can I ask you to give us the view from Shanghai?
Yes, thank you, Eden. Glad to join you this morning. This year's election in the U.S. has drawn a lot of attention in China. People pay attention to this election not only because they are interested in knowing who is going to be the next U.S. president and how U.S. China relations will look like in the first years. But more importantly, this election really serves as a lens through which to say how much the U.S. has changed and will continue to change. I mean, first of all, it seems that the Republican Party has been completely and to some extent hopelessly Trumpified in the last several years. If you look how easily Trump has won the nomination of the GOP, and now the entire party is rallying behind him in the campaign, that's amazing. And the second impression is, frankly speaking, the degeneration of U.S. political culture. I mean, for the presidential election, what matters is not only in policy but also personality. In that regard, I mean, in the last several years since 2016, Trump certainly has introduced vulgarity into U.S. political culture, and this year more than that, he is, a felon and still a legal candidate for the Republican Party and may become the next U.S. president. So people wonder, whether there's still a bottom line for the U.S. politics, and there's still some decency for political figures in this country. The third question is how far and how fast U.S. will be transformed after the election. I mean, no matter who is going to be the next U.S. president, U.S. will become more inward-looking because the domestic challenges are becoming more salient. And the U.S. is going to be more protectionist under either a Republican or Democratic president. And also, U.S. will become more unilateralist. America First will be the common language for both parties. The only difference is, the degree between two parties. not the direction. And finally, I mean, as someone who has studied the U.S. politics for decades, I think this election is a severe challenge, a test to U.S. political system. No matter what the outcome looks like, this election only shows that the system is cracking and is under extreme pressure. Now let me turn to China-U.S. relations for a very brief comment. I think we have mainly two major concerns. One is about economic ties between China-U.S. Trump and his senior advisors have already indicated, if elected, they are going to impose further tariff on import from China and may remove the permanent normal trade relations treatment for China. What does that mean for China? It means there will be drastic reduction in the Chinese export to the United States. And that means jeopardizing over $400 billion export from China. And this will certainly raise unemployment and slow down economy and shrink the Chinese GDP. So that's going to be a devastating effect on the Chinese economy. As someone teaching at university, I also worry about the people-to-people exchanges, because I think in the possible Trump administration, some people not only want to push for decoupling in trade, investment, and technology flow, they also want to cut off the people-to-people exchanges. These days, we have over 300,000 Chinese students studying in the United States. If this decoupling is going to happen, they will have a lot of impact on the future career of these students. And the ties between two countries will suffer heavily, and cutting off the people-to-people exchanges not only will contribute to the distrust and suspicion between two countries, but will really contribute to the hostility between two societies. So I think, U.S.-China relations will be seriously tested after the election. So with that, I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Xinbo, for really spelling out and underlining the scale of the stakes in this election, because I'm sure you're not alone, and this feeling is shared on the part of many Americans as well, that the China-U.S. relationship is the strategic relationship that's most under pressure. I'll say a little bit about Europe at the end, but I really appreciate your candor in underlining the seriousness of the stakes here. Nerima, rather kind of the other end of the geopolitical spectrum, one's tempted to say Kenya has emerged in many respects as a key, well, partner might be too strong a word, but nevertheless asset perhaps, or some might say it's in the crosshairs of American policy. Kenya suddenly features and bulks very large on the geopolitical radar in Washington, D.C. And it will be fascinating to get your view on how the election looks from the side and what implications you think it might possibly have.
Right, sure. Thank you so much for this opportunity. And, as we look at the world's largest democracy gearing up for its election, Kenyans are observing closely, and there's a reason why. Kenya, as you know, we are very politically engaged as a nation. I mean, our streets, our homes, our media, everywhere is alive with political conversations, and our attention often extends beyond our borders. And we've been seeing large rallies, celebrity-started campaigns, and also very controversial statements that have been made by both candidates. But this year is particularly interesting through our lens to view the U.S. political scene. And this is because of the several events that have happened in this year alone. So first, let's consider the deployment of Kenyan troops to Haiti. So the decision, while intended as a sign of international cooperation, was met with public frustration at home. Many Kenyans felt it was simply not our priority, especially given the challenges we're facing domestically. Earlier this year, we had a wave of massive protests, and These protests highlighted issues that Kenyans were demanding immediate attention, from the economy, political reforms, human rights. And at a large scale, it appears that they've subsided, but we still see pockets of protest and public dissent in response to some of these policies that feel out of touch with our needs. So in comes sending troops to Haiti. So it felt like a distraction, a move that seemed more about maintaining diplomatic ties than addressing the pressing issues Kenyans face daily. However, our president went forward with the decision, underscoring Kenyans' growing strategic role on the international stage. So this brings us to the moment our president, became the first African leader in the last 20 years, a state visit to White House to meet President Joe Biden. And the visit highlighted Kenya's new role as a NATO partner, so reflecting an even deeper alignment between Kenya and the US. But these developments raise questions in our minds. What does Kenya stand to gain, and how does this affect us at home? And perhaps how much of an influence does the US have on us? For example, for some, they feel the influence is overwhelming. So for example, one perception we have of Meg Whitman, she's the US ambassador to Kenya. Local illustrations and opinion pieces depict her as overly capitalistic and sometimes singularly focused on business. Many see her as having a very close relationship with our president, and one that some perceive as prioritizing American economic interests above Kenyan sovereignty. So this sentiment has even led some Kenyans to support Donald Trump's candidacy in the US election, believing that under Trump, the US foreign policy would involve less direct intervention in our domestic affairs. And some are excited about Kamala because she's being the first female president, but we struggle with women's representation in our own politics. When you look at the East African region, we have the worst representation when it comes to women. So in conclusion, Kenyans are well aware that the US election will affect our country in significant ways, and there's a diversity of opinion on how that influence should be wielded. We are acutely conscious of our growing entanglements with the US, a powerful nation whose policies and politics resonate globally. However, for many Kenyans, our focus remains squarely on our needs. We aspire to address our economic struggles, ensure political transparency, and pursue a future where Kenya's voice is neither subdued or overshadowed by foreign interests. Thank you.
It's very interesting to hear that theme echoed of the logic of self-interest to an extent that we also heard from Ambassador Rao earlier on, that we need to understand the reactions of the world, first and foremost, always through their own local forces and politics. I think it's very important to realize that from a US perspective. Evren, it would be wonderful to get your view of this from the Turkish side.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. As with all the other countries, and the speakers have been mentioning that the American elections are monitored so closely in Turkey, almost as if they are domestic events. We do know the importance of swing states, understand the mechanics of the electoral college, and track Harris and Trump's differing views on issues like crime and migration. But to understand why Turkey pays such close attention to American elections, I think we should explore a significant shift in context that has shaped the perspective of America in Turkey. Turkey is a cusp state situated on the boundary between Europe and the Middle East, embodying aspects of both, yet not fully belonging to either. And this in-betweenness has allowed Turkey to highlight both identities or to lean more toward one over the other. After the Cold War, up until 2 decades ago, the European identity was more prominent. But in my lifetime, that perspective has shifted dramatically. Today, Turkey is often regarded as a Middle Eastern country, Middle Eastern identity more frequently emphasized. And this dual identity and geography deeply influence its stakes in two pressing global conflicts, the war in Ukraine and the war in the Middle East. And each carries critical implications for Turkey's regional security, strategy, identity, and so on and so forth. So meanwhile, the outcome of the US elections could significantly alter the trajectory of both conflicts. The two most pressing questions that the Turkish electorate are asking is, first, which candidate is more likely to end these wars? And second, under what conditions? So now, if we consider Turkey aligned with Europe, a Trump victory would be seen as a setback. A Turkey within Europe would likely feel depressed by such an outcome. This is because Turkey in Europe depends on multilateral America, committed to NATO and transatlantic security. And as we know, Trump has proposed negotiating a ceasefire that might allow Russia to retain certain territories, emphasizing a need to reassess US support and prioritize domestic interests. The somewhat softer stance toward Russia could embolden Russia in Ukraine, which threatens Turkey's interests in the Black Sea. Furthermore, Turkey, as a part of Europe, is also concerned about the democracy. While Turkish democracy is right now very strained, a vibrant opposition persists, and the erosion of global democratic standards would be deeply demoralizing. A Trump victory would likely mean further backsliding on issues like gender equality and a resurgence of conservative values. And this backlash would hit democratic actors back in Turkey very hard, reinforcing the struggles that they already face. Now shift the lens to Turkey as part of the Middle East. Unlike Turkey in Europe, Turkey in the Middle East won't feel that depressed or disheartened by shifts in US leadership. In fact, the Turkish government and much of the public believe that the war in Gaza has been supported, if not enabled, by the Biden administration. Despite claims of attempting to restrain the Netanyahu government, the US has continued to provide substantial military aid to Israel, a widely reported fact in Turkey that fuels skepticism towards Biden, and a Harris administration is also viewed as likely to continue Biden's policies in Gaza, further reinforcing the perception of a weak US stance limiting Israel. On the other hand, we know that the Trump administration has never been pro-Palestinian. It brokered the Abraham Accords, cut aid to Palestinian programs, formally recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital, and so on and so forth. And as for Turkey, bilateral relations under Trump were strained by cuts to sanctions, continued US support for Kurdish forces in Syria, and many other things. Yet Trump is prominent in the region for three key reasons, for Turkey as well. First, Trump is seen as powerful, and that power comes from his unpredictability. It is seen as a strength in a region where unpredictability often signals power, masculinity, masculine image, which very much resonates with the leaders who favor a strong and personal style. And second, Trump's perceived authority allowed him to be seen as capable of leveraging influence over Netanyahu government, and he is seen as he could be the guy who could strike a ceasefire in the region. Third, his hawkish policies on Iran, exiting the nuclear deal, imposing severe sanctions, pursuing a maximum pressure campaign, aligns very well with regional priorities as well. So now what we see here are two sharply divergent perspectives. This isn't merely a polarization, it's the profound divergence in interest, which is in the same country. On the one side, you see Turkey and Europe seeking democratic resilience, multilateral security, and this and that. On the other side, you have the Turkey in the Middle East, aligned with power-based pragmatic diplomacy of Trump. So the American elections offers two vastly different trajectories for each Turkey. And I'm going to stop here and by saying this, regardless of who wins the US election, as in the case of India, the Turkish government, I think from afar, what I see is that it really stands ready to work with the next administration. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Evren. That was a fantastically illuminating analysis. I love very much this idea of two faces of Turkey providing very different perspectives on the US election. I'd love to come back to that in another round. Daniel, it would be great to get your view from Chile.
Thank you, Adam. I'm joining you from Latin America, and when you see US election from our point of view, the first thing that you could say is what is happening over there looks very familiar to us over here in Latin America. It is like watching a movie where everything takes place in another country, where the characters speak a different language, but the plot seems like our local story. And the plot goes as follows. People in a country are upset because of social injustice, enraged that elites seem aloof, concerned about their own issues, disconnected from the majority of the population problems. Political parties and democratic institutions do not seem to be working in the benefit of the common people. Rapid social change and economic disruption makes everybody feel anxious about the future. And then a man emerges. And it's always a man, not a woman. He comes from the elite. Maybe he's a millionaire, maybe he's an ex-military or a politician, but he declares that he is different. Unlike the rest of the elite, he is the only one that really understands the common people and the issues at hand. He's charismatic, he's flamboyant, even funny. He's a good entertainer. He speaks effortlessly. He looks spontaneous. He seems like the real thing. And he is also a man full of rage. He taps into the anxiety, into the frustrations. He announced that things are very bad and headed for worse. If he comes from the left, he will blame economic elites and the fact that they accumulate wealth and impoverish the rest of the common folks. If he comes from the right, he will blame the cultural elites, the arrogant intellectuals, scientists, and journalists that lie and cheat to protect their privileges. And in the dire face of this scenario, he is the one that brings the good news. He can fix it. He will fix it if we can all agree on one small condition. And that condition is that he cannot do the job with the obstacles placed by Congress or an independent judiciary or the free press. He needs absolute power in his hands to do the job. And he also needs time, because the job cannot be done in just 4 years. So he needs power, he needs time, he needs freedom from all system to disrupt, to change, to finally fix it all. In Latin America, we have seen this movie happen far too many times, and we named these main characters, these strongmen, a caudillo. He can be a right-wing free market strongman, like Fujimori in Peru or nowadays Bukele in El Salvador, a kind of fascist figure like Getúlio Vargas in Brazil or Perón in Argentina, or he can also be a left-wing socialist leader like Chavez and Maduro in Venezuela and Ortega in Nicaragua. It doesn't matter. Caudillos can be of different flavors or inclination, but caudillos nonetheless. And the outcome or evolution of these stories are more or less the same. A caudillo wins the elections, starts his term as a democratic leader, and eventually uses all institutions and power available to destroy the system of checks and balances that is in place from the inside, perpetuating himself in power. And here's the spoiler. This movie never have a happy ending. People may be happy for some time because, yes, the caudillo method is efficient. When you don't have to respect the law or bureaucracy or the sluggish methods of democracy, you can pass reforms, you can distribute money and funds to those who are in need, and you can be tough on crime. But, spoiler again, it does not work in the long run, because we know for certain that power corrupts and that absolute power brings absolute corruption. Even if we believe that the caudillo is benevolent and has the best of intentions, concentration of power on his figure leads to abuse, authoritarianism, and corruption. And I think that is what the US is experiencing right now. After 8 years of Trumpism, you can see it. 4 years ago, Jorge Castañeda, who is a respected intellectual, former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Mexico, wrote that President Trump is not on the verge of becoming a strongman or a caudillo. To become that, Castañeda wrote, Trump must show a willingness for perpetuating his position of power. 4 years later, after the January 6th attacks on the Capitol, after resisting election results and the peaceful transition of power, after his promise to be a dictator just for 1 day, after the threats to persecute the political adversaries and use soldiers against citizens, I think maybe we should pay attention, listen carefully, and believe what Trump is saying. And what he is saying is that he is a caudillo. He is a wannabe dictator. And that if given a second chance, maybe he will succeed in doing what he says he wants to do. And believe me, coming from Latin America, where we have already gone through this is not a story that you want for your country, and this is not the movie you want to see.
Daniel, thank you so much for that eloquent warning. It's really been an extraordinary series of contributions, and one of the things that allows us to do that at CGT in Columbia University is the network of global centers that we have around the world. And I particularly want to acknowledge the cooperation in pulling this panel together of our contacts in Istanbul and Mumbai and Santiago, which played a key role in helping us put together this extraordinary panel. So it's really a privilege to be part of this conversation. One of the hats that I wear at Columbia is as the director of the European Institute. And Evren's comments triggered me into thinking that perhaps I ought to add a few words about how this looks from the point of view of Berlin, particularly, but also perhaps the UK and other players in Europe. Because Evren, in her brilliantly illuminating kind of double optic on Turkey, was stressing the stakes which are involved for you said, the European Turkey. I would say, I think, for Europe as a whole. I mean, so intense is the interest that I will have German journalists camping in my apartment in New York for most of the next week and into next week, because the need for coverage of the events in America is so intense. It's kind of hyper domestic news. It's domestic news plus. It's not less than domestic news. It's kind of more real and more important. And I think, again, it's, as many of the speakers have said, there is a structural relationship that's at play here. And I would say about Europe that there are pragmatic reasons for deep concern about this election. And those go in two basic directions. One is to do with security. The Ukraine war, which has featured in a number of people's comments, is, depending on your view of the question, either inside Europe or on Europe's border. And it is a large, massive, it's the largest conventional war that Europe has seen since World War II. It doesn't compare in lethality, despite the dramas that go on with events in East Africa, for instance, and the Horn of Africa in recent years. And there is a hugely distorted optic on this. In terms of intensity, it doesn't compare with the slaughter in the Middle East, but it is nevertheless an extraordinarily dramatic event, which has produced millionfold displacement. And the consensus, I think, in Europe is that that war cannot be sustained without American input. And in a really extraordinary breach with precedent, despite the confidence some of the folks on the panel have expressed about the continuity of foreign policy, the way the Europeans experience American policy under Trump in particular has been astonishingly erratic. And I actually think amongst the different angles of American foreign policy, the one which is most steady is perhaps the relationship with India. The one which is very erratic, often disrespectful, notably under Trump, is with regard to Africa. The one which is consistently antagonistic is with regard to China. And the one which is most like a roller coaster is the relationship to Europe, arguably. If there's a consistent thread through America's relations with South and Latin America, it's sort of not prioritizing it the way that you would expect, given how important it is, and given how far we actually share the continent with so many fellow citizens and migrants from, across the Western Hemisphere. But the Europeans have really experienced their relations with Europe, with the United States, as contentious and difficult ever since the period of the Iraq War in 2003. Obama was cool but professional. Trump was profoundly erratic, and the Biden team have been a hot flush of kind of late Atlanticism that has been very sentimentally attractive and consoling, but is unlikely to last. It feels like the last of the great Atlanticist moments in relations between Europe and the US. It has something to do with the president's vintage. It's difficult to imagine a new generation, which Obama, in a sense, represented, of American leaders taking so deep an interest in Europe. And it doesn't make that much sense either from America's global point of view. And the Europeans know this, but are having a very hard time growing out of the dependence which they have grown into. during the Cold War and its aftermath. The second dimension is economic. America is a vital trading partner for Europe as it is for China. And so the talk of protectionism, which extends to Europe as well, and other than the Chinese trade deficit, the German trade deficit is the thing which troubles Trump most, is profoundly worrying to Europe, especially because it's under competitive pressure of a very intense kind from China at this moment. But beyond that, I think, and this is perhaps different from all of the other panelists here, I think it's undeniable, whether Trump wants to recognize it or not, or whether it makes that much sense to regular Americans in the day-to-day, but in a rather asymmetric way, Europe's identity, Western Europe's identity in particular, but also that I think of Poland, is tied up at the level of identity, at the level of the politics of emotions with the United States. Several people mentioned the effect that a Trump victory would have on the spirits, if you like, of democratic politics in their regions or in their country. But I think in Europe, notably in Germany, the most powerful European state, it really goes to the very identity of the state. They could not in Berlin self-confidently say what we heard, for instance, from Ambassador Rao about India. Germany is not a civilizational state in that sense, or to an extent that it's civilizational, it believes it shared its civilization under the umbrella of the NATO alliance with the United States. And so and we see on the one hand, the desperate effort to assert that in Berlin's, how else can one say it, but slavish adherence to the line that the United States have followed in the Middle East. But they know deep down that the trouble is in the United States itself. And the very fact, whether or not Trump is elected, the very fact that he's running Harris as close as he is sign enough that American political culture is in fact quite different from that of Europe. Maybe one could say, this feels almost condescending, Daniel, tell me, but you encourage this. It feels more Latin American at this point, perhaps, than it does like Western European politics in the Cold War period. And that for the Europeans comes as a profound shock. And it's an identity shock. So I actually think that in that sense, this election is at some level perhaps most disturbing for America's allies in Europe, because it goes beyond the pragmatic, it goes beyond security and economics to the question of their own conception. Insofar as this talk of the West and so on, the democracy versus autocracy distinction has made any sense at all, it's made a sense within the frame of a neo-Atlanticism that the Biden team has revived with such energy. And if that were to fragment at this moment, I think it leaves Europe adrift. And it's not a moment of local strength where you would expect them to rally around their own programs. So this has been an incredibly rich exchange from the panelists up here. I was wondering how we might, whether there were questions that you wanted to ask each other. Otherwise, I was very taken by Evren's sort of kaleidoscopic approach, which said, assuming that Turkey has two ways of thinking about itself, what impact does the election have in, as it were, depending on which one of those faces you adopt? I wonder whether that would be true, whether other folks would see that as a useful optic through which to view the American election in their particular region or their particular country. I realize there are constraints in people talking about this to an extent, but it still provides, it struck me as a very interesting optic. Is this, Nerima, you spoke in relatively guarded terms, but Kenyan democracy has been convulsed, right? On the one hand, it was celebrated and is celebrated quite rightly as one of the most sophisticated African polities, but it is convulsed by the events of recent months. Do you have a sense that a Trump victory, does it make any difference one way or another to the power of democratic forces in your country, to put it in general terms, or is that just too crude and analytic to be of any real use?
No, it's not crude at all. I didn't touch into religion and just how important religion is to us. And the country, majority Christian, and of course the narrative and framing Trump as being the more Christian candidate, there's also this fear of LGBTQI all over the region. We have seen how Uganda has placed laws in place basically outlawing homosexuality, and there've been conversations around family planning, there've been conversations around outlawing homosexuality in Kenya as well. So that's what makes the situation very sensitive. So they look at the Biden administration as going against family, going against tradition, going against culture, which makes it a bit complicated. But again, they look at Trump's administration as one that doesn't interfere as much. A lot of people are concerned with the silence that we've gotten from the United States, especially during the protests. We had over 60 young people shot and killed. We still don't have any answers as to who killed them, etc. And at one point, Blinken did call our president and just basically did a firing shot and said, you know, at the rate the country is going, it doesn't look like it's going in the right direction. So you can see a sense of, as we are getting closer to November, a silence when it comes to the United States in terms of democracy, human rights, the things that they stand for. And we feel that as Kenyan people, we were pulled into Haiti, pulled into this war that we have no part of being a part of. And we are seen as other Africans as the traitors. Like, why would we do this to our people? And that has also given us a different perception as being the United States friend, but in the region, we are the enemy. So we are being viewed that way by the continent, not as being Pan-African. And it's fascinating because I did mention that the US has been really keen on the economy, and focusing very little on human rights, the people, and relationships. And so we're seeing this almost harvesting from US corporations. We've seen a lot of US corporations move into the country and no really regulatory frameworks. So we are seeing that perhaps, and a lot of people are saying, perhaps with Trump coming in, the foreign interventions will be less. They feel that way because at the moment they feel that we are too intertwined with the United States at the moment.
Ambassador Rao, I know you have to leave us in a few minutes' time, so I'd be very keen to hear your reaction to the panel. I mean, amongst other things, another issue that strikes me as interesting, we've spoken a lot about the way in which people outside the US view the US election and its likely impact. But in the case of India, after all, there is a very substantial Indian diasporic community in the United States who, for whom this is, you know, a matter of a more direct interest. And I wonder whether you have particular insights you could offer on the developments within that community as well, and how it relates to the ongoing relations between India and the US.
Well, I think diaspora politics, and particularly Indian diaspora politics in the United States, are very keenly followed in India by the media and by the intelligentsia and the community that looks at geopolitics and bilateral relations with the United States. And it is a matter of satisfaction, I think, for all Indians, regardless of their political affiliations, to see the way the Indian diaspora in the United States has progressed and has been mainstreamed literally into every walk of American life. Kamala Harris herself, is of Indian descent. Her mother was from the city of Chennai in the deep south of India. So there is, although she does not really talk about her Indian connection in so many words, and I think the impression is that she identifies herself more as an African American, but that Indian connection is very much there. And it's a recent connection because she has relatives, uncles and aunties, as we say, in India, and who speak about her and her childhood. But I think, taking up what Evren said and what Daniel said, this thing about having a two-sided or two-faceted approach to what happens in the United States, I think is a very relevant issue for many democracies such as ours. Because on the one hand, India would like relations with the United States to prosper and to develop and to acquire further substance and meaning. But at the same time, there is a very deep sensitivity to anything that is perceived as interference in our domestic politics, because there is our own brand, as it were. The Americans speak of exceptionalism. We see our own brand of exceptionalism kicking in when you have such situations. I was very taken with Daniel's reference to the caudillo, having lived in Peru myself during the Fujimori years and understood, the way that works. So when it comes to an election victory, as some predict for Mr. Donald Trump, former President Trump, some questions are raised, obviously, within India. But by and large, I think within the establishment particularly, he's seen as somebody who's a known factor. He's been president before. He has a very good chemistry with Prime Minister Modi. And he speaks, in fact, Mr. Trump even alluded to that in one of his recent election meetings. So from that stems a certain self-assurance within India, I may say, about the direction of Indo-US relations in the future, regardless of who wins the election. But as, I think it was Ezra Klein of the New York Times who pointed out recently that Mr. Trump is a very disinhibited person, and he changes his mind constantly, and he's very taken in by the immediacy of the situation as it presents itself. So we really don't know what that direction would be when it comes to this very consequential relationship between two of our democracies. As you know, India sees itself as the largest democracy in the world today with our 1.5 billion people. We just had a very successful general election, as you know, close to 900 million people voted. And given our young demographic, I think the focus really is on the economy, is on economic, the betterment of people's lives. And in a sense, to deploy this relationship that we have with the United States to our benefit within the country in terms of our progress and development. So it's a very interesting time, as the Chinese would say. We live in very interesting times. But I believe that with a growingly confident India, I think any candidate who wins the election will have to take that into account while deploying American interests in our region and what India's reaction would be. I mean, we are quite comfortable with the United States' presence in the Indo-Pacific. And we also, may I say, have a difficult relationship with China, although, we've tried to manage that relationship, both our countries, in a way that seeks to reduce tension on our very unresolved common border, as you know. And that becomes a trigger point very often, as it did in the last 4 years, for that kind of tension. But here again, I don't think in any way that we're looking at American involvement in pulling the coals out of that fire. We look at these issues with important neighbors, key neighbors like China, as issues that we have to reflect on, tackle, and try and resolve bilaterally. So that, again, is going to continue. But we'll have to see what the outcome of the relationship, of the election will be. I think the two wars in Ukraine and the Middle East are going to continue to occupy a great deal of attention, even in our own region, because these wars affect us, affect shipping in the region, affect our economy, affect our energy security, our defense interests. As you know, with Russia, that has been one of the aspects that India has continued to really follow and foster despite the war in Ukraine, because it is in the interests of our country, which is what we constantly stress. We will do as we feel is in our interest, whatever the situation.
Thank you, Ambassador Rao. I know you have to go. Thank you so much for contributing to the panel. I was wondering whether we might, in the final segment of the conversation, try to tease out the theme that was addressed by both Professor Wu Xinbo and Daniel Matamala, and I think lurks in the background also of Evren's comments, which, I mean, to use Professor Wu's unforgiving phrase, is degeneracy. I don't think that is an overstatement, but I think it will be great to pick deeper and pick apart what exactly we mean by that and what we think the causal driver is. Because it seems to me, on the one hand, Professor Wu, you introduced the element of vulgarity, which I don't think is out of place. It's a highly gendered, highly sexualized, aggressively sexualized kind of form of masculinism. And you could say at one level that fits quite nicely with Daniel's sketch for us of a kind of hemispheric Chaldeism or whatever that's now sort of taking hold of Northern America as well. But I mean, there's a bit of me that doesn't want to credit Trump with the chutzpah and vision of a real Caudillo, right? Of one of the classic caudillos of Latin America. Does he really have all that it takes, or is this basically a man out of the party scene of New York in the 1970s and 1980s who basically has never grown up? And he's still a louche, uninhibited, disinhibited is the phrase that's been used, and it's surely right. He may be increasingly disinhibited, you know, type from that scene without really the kind of visionary sense of promise that he aspires to in his rhetoric. How seriously should we take this degeneracy, and what is its nature? Because obviously, coming from the European historical background, there's also the analogy to fascism, which is sometimes mobilized. Comparisons are made to Erdogan as another possible figure. It's not coincidental that Trump seems to have something of a man crush on Vladimir Putin, and that he very much enjoyed his interactions with Xi Jinping and with MBS in Saudi Arabia. Like, how do we read this? How do we read this? And that is not meant as a disrespectful alignment of all of those characters in a single roster, because they are all individually, in fact, quite different. And are we, in a sense, by aligning them all and analogizing them all to Trump, misunderstanding the nature of this relationship? Just to take the Putin example, because he's relatively neutral and no one is speaking for Russia here, Putin comes up hard, and he was, after all, the bona fide KGB agent, which is far more actual credentials as a tough guy than Donald Trump will ever have to show for himself. How do we read this degeneracy? Maybe Professor Wu, you'd like to, because maybe you'd like to expand on it a little.
Okay, Adam, I think the point here is not so much about Trump himself. I mean, every person has his own personality, for good or for worse. But the trick is that, you know, in spite of this personality, or just because of this personality, he has become so popular among his supporters. That's something amazing, and why the only plausible explanation, in my opinion, is that people have become so disappointed with the political elite in the United States, with the establishment. So they really want someone like Trump to, you know, not only to cripple the establishment, the institutions, but really to reshape the political culture. So I think that's something shocking. I mean, as I already alluded to, you know, through this election, we can say how much the U.S. has changed in the last several years, and how fast it will change in the next 4 years if Trump gets elected. So, I mean, if there's going to be a red wave, you know, Republicans takes the presidency and the Senate and House of the Congress, then, I mean, Trump will be pretty much at a free hand to do whatever he wants to say in the next 4 years. Not just about, you know, deportation of millions of illegal immigrants, but also kicking off maybe hundreds of thousands of senior federal employees who are regarded as unloyal to him. Yeah, I mean, that's the standard. You know, he openly advocated for in judging other people. So this goes to my another comment, which is the U.S. political system, U.S. democracy is really cracking. And the biggest, even if Harris wins the election, I guess that may not be because, you know, people believe she can fix the problem, but rather because the moderates are concerned about the damage that Trump may do in the next 4 years.
Yeah.
So in that sense, I don't see, you know, a clear answer from this election that America is in the right direction to fix the problem.
Yes, it really does feel as though it's basically all hands on deck until the man finally passes from the stage. And whilst Trump, the spirit of Trump is still abroad, it's a kind of continuous defensive struggle. I mean, Daniel, I would really love to get your reactions. I mean, am I underestimating Trump or am I overestimating caudillos in general? Are they generally more? Are they a little less serious than I see them as being from afar?
Yeah, I think you're underestimating Trump and maybe overestimating the check and balances in the U.S. democracy, because you can say, of course, Trump was president before 4 years and he was not able to destroy democracy, but he tried to do it. I mean, he tried actively to do it. He even tried to resort to violence to avoid giving power to the elected president when he lost the election. He was not able to do it because, of course, the U.S. institutional system is very robust and has a lot of check and balances, the civil society, the free press, the independent judiciary, an army that is not involved in politics. So you have a lot of difficult obstacles for a caudillo to succeed in having all the power. But I must say that I think that these check and balances are weaker now than they were 4 or 8 years ago. For example, the Republican Party is absolutely no obstacle for Trump. It's now a completely personal party of him. If Trump wins, he probably will have majority in the Congress. Even the Supreme Court is now saying that whatever a president does, he will not be prosecuted. So he's giving like a free pass to a second Trump presidency in breaking the law. So the judiciary, the independence of the judiciary is now also, I think, weak in the US. You, of course, have free press, but Trump has been able to bypass the free press, creating an alternative reality when his supporters does not care about what the press can investigate, what the press can reveal. So I will think that a second Trump presidency will be far more dangerous than the first one. They are also more organized. They are very, they understand that bureaucracy was an obstacle in the first government, and they are well organized to try to put loyalties in all the relevant positions in government. So I will think that Trump has the intention, is now better prepared than he was 8 years ago. His supporters are more radical and more extreme. And I will say there is a present danger that he will be more successful now than the first time in trying to undermine and finally try to destroy democracy. Yeah.
I mean, if maybe in the final round, we should just consider the question of how many of you, and maybe this is a kind of lightning question for the final panel, is who do you expect to win? And assuming you, and let us distinguish here between like the actual outcome and the electoral outcome and the process of the handoff. Maybe we can do a quick round on this. I mean, how do you see the transition going, and how do you expect to win? Evren, maybe I can start with you.
Sure, but may I add something to the previous round? I mean, two colleagues of mine had did this study on how this authoritarian leaders, let me say, not authoritarian leaders, but strong leaders became dictators. And we have created a data set that includes the whole 20th century. And what really mattered and what we have seen in that data set is that it is not the institutional strength, but the political experience that really shapes this transition. So the leaders with more political experience, even though the institutions, even where the institutions are strong, they are more capable of transitioning their countries from democracy to authoritarianism. So I do agree that a second term would mean that a Trump with more political experience, with intimate knowledge of how political institutions work, is much more of a threat to the democracy than a first Trump term. And having said that, unfortunately, I mean, looking at the polls, I do think that the likelihood of Trump winning this election is a bit more. So
you're in the pessimistic camp, Professor Wu. Yes. Where do you stand on this? On the election, do you have a take on who do you think is going to win?
Well, I always I mean, I'm biased, so I hope Harris will win, but I'm concerned that Trump will defeat her.
Right.
That's
that is
concern.
Yeah. Nerima, you're nodding. Do you think that is the prevalent view in your quarters in Kenya as well?
Yeah, I have the same opinion as Professor Wu, and Trump definitely has the attributes of an African president, from his behavior to how he speaks, his promises, the policies, definitely, and most of those guys win. But I'm hoping for Harris.
Daniel, where are you at on this?
Well, I think it's a coin in the air, you know, it's head or tails, you don't know really. But it's really incredible that the future of the world, the future of world peace, the future of climate change is now depending maybe on some 1,000 voters in some small town in Pennsylvania. And we are all, the entire world is just watching, and the decision will be so like decisive, but a few votes in one particular country, in one particular state of this country is really incredible how history can absolutely change because this kind of small things. Maybe because a comedian make a joke about Puerto Ricans, and maybe that will save democracy. I don't know. like history depends on small details sometimes.
I can't decide in my own head whether this is the perversion and the absurdity of democracy or its great glory. I can't decide in my head whether this is exactly how the system is supposed to function, or whether it is, as you say, one of the most absurd things you can possibly imagine. In any case, thank you so much, all of you, for being with us this morning, for volunteering to do this, for giving us your insights. It's really been an extraordinary, illuminating panel. A demonstration also, if I may say, in a two-tar horn of the reach of Columbia University's network, and a great opportunity to get to know you all. And I hope very much that at CGT we'll be able to welcome you, whether it is in New York in person or again in a remote event like this in future. Thank you very much. Be well, and fingers crossed.
Bye-bye.
Fingers crossed for next week.